Hello, everyone. We're in the room with Dr. Terry Alford. Very lucky to have him with us. I am Sharon Pratt. I'm the founding director of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. We just say IPPH, and the former mayor, or one of the former mayors of Washington, D.C. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Terry Alford as we explore the life of Abraham Lincoln, a defining father in terms of the growth and evolution of Washington, D.C. Thank you, Dr. Alford, for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So, Dr. Alford is a retired historian from the Northern Virginia Community College. He has served as an advisor and a consultant to a great many documentaries, including films, including Spielberg's film about Abraham Lincoln, and is probably one of the leading experts on the Booth family. So, we really want to do a deep dive into John Wilkes Booth, but also in particular the connection of Booth and Lincoln, not only around the assassination, but around the whole dynamic spiritualism. Dr. Alford, as we explore that, uh, we want to talk about spiritualism. And before we get too deep into it, could you explain and define for our audiences just what is spiritualism?
When we say spiritualism in a modern sense, we mean a movement that began a few years before the Civil War, when two teenage girls in upstate New York claimed to have heard voices and received communications from a dead man who was buried in the cellar of their house. And they were intermediaries, in other words, from someone on the other side, they claim, who was, there, present, interested in them, and passing on messages to them and their family. And this movement, this phenomenon must have touched the core because it spread like wildfire across the country. The next thing you knew, there were seances going on in almost every town. There were professional mediums going around. It was really quite a thing.
So we know that it intensifies or seems to really take hold during the Civil War, which you can sort of understand, I guess, because of so much death. Is that correct? That it really, seemed much more enmeshed in the American life during that period of time when there was so much death?
Well, absolutely. The war was a terrible thing, and it killed hundreds of thousands of young men who were the pride and hope of their families when you really come down to it. And it just seemed spiritualism offered a way to stay in touch with them, or to be with them, and to receive. What they're doing is they're there to give you guidance. They're there to give you comfort. There's always a question of to what extent this supplemented or surpassed the religions that were set up at the time, and that's something we can also talk about. But we have to remember also in the 1850s, people didn't live very long. If your mother lived to be 40, you were kind of lucky in the Civil War years. If your dad lived to be 45, you were kind of lucky. So these were hard times with wear and tear, infections, accidents, and then you throw the war on top of it, where you could just imagine, the spiritual longing and hunger that was out there for a movement like this.
So your book, In the House of Their Dead, the Lincolns, the Booths, and their spirits, you sort of help us understand or possibly understand how it was these two families in particular moved in the direction of spiritualism, that there was some element of it in their early lives. Now, and they're very different lives, a very different profile, seemingly, of Abraham Lincoln as against the Booth family. The Booth family were distinguished actors.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham Lincoln was really dirt poor.
That's right.
Uh, he was, seemingly, he was dirt poor. So, could you give us a sense of whether Lincoln, was he superstitious? Why was he superstitious? Who encouraged that? Sort of as a sense of early life for Abraham Lincoln in this direction?
Well, you made a very good point. The families were very different. John Wilkes' parents were immigrants from London, and they had only come in the 1820s. They had only come in the generation before the war. Lincoln's family goes all the way back pretty much to Puritan times, and they were frontier people where the Booths were more urban. So there was a very big difference there. On the superstition thing, though, it's interesting. People were, this is an age, as I like to make the point, of amazing discoveries, of incipient industrialization, of discoveries of things like the hypodermic syringe and absolute zero. And people were getting more scientific than they had ever been. But at the same time, they were superstitious. You can change conditions, but you and I have probably wondered sometimes, can you change people? There's something about that. And in their case, for example, Mary Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife, was fearful of Fridays, probably because of what happened on Good Friday with Jesus.
Right.
So a lot of people would not sign an important contract on Friday, wouldn't plant their major crops on Friday, would not start a big trip on Friday, would not get married on Friday. That was just kind of the one day of the week to be afraid of. Abraham Lincoln, he was very logical in some ways, but he had this he had this superstitious vein that a friend of his said ran through him. Like if you see a piece of marble, decorative marble, you can see kind of a bluish vein running through it sometimes, that this streak that Lincoln himself realized was sort of irrational. Nevertheless, it was there, and he was remarkably superstitious person.
Well, with Mary Todd Lincoln, I know you said in your book that she had this fear of Fridays, and I think that had been imbued in her in part by one of the servants of the family. She was lived. Her family were enslavers. She was born in Kentucky, right?
Right.
And one of the people who worked for her told her to be fearful of Friday because that's when all of her misdeeds would catch up with her. And it would seem that it was true. I mean, she lost a son on Friday. Then she lost her father-in-law on a Friday, and then she loses her husband on Good Friday. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. So that does seem to be an electric date for her, doesn't it?
it
It was
does. And then go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, on your point, it's kind of funny to think that her this nurse and companion she had, who was enslaved, as you said, did tell her that every Friday, the Jaybirds wrote down everything she had done wrong and flew off to tell the devil about it, so he could write it in a big book against her name. And just something that was, like you say, ingrained in her.
Yeah, and then with Lincoln, his mother seemingly had some intuitive impulses, as did his stepmother. Is that correct? Or is that correct?
Yes, I think we don't know as much about his birth mother as we would like to.
Right.
His stepmother outlived him, so we know more. But they were both superstitious, and her dad and his dad, I might say, was given to dreams. He had a dream one time. His father, Lincoln's father, Thomas, of traveling down a road and going in a house and meeting a woman, and it was so vivid to him that he actually took that trip and found that woman there and wound up marrying her. The story goes so. Those were interesting times and characters.
And then with Lincoln, I mean, it would appear that his much of his ambition, in many ways, was fueled by his own premonitions. I mean, when you think of how he was born into almost nothing, that he didn't even have windows or a floor in the log cabin until his stepmother arrived. And he had virtually no education. I mean, what he achieved is remarkable. It's just unimaginable in many ways. Um, and he had strong premonition about his purpose and potential in life, did he not?
He did. It's interesting. He had two kind of impelling feelings. One, that he was going to be a great person, perhaps even president. And secondly, that something terrible was going to happen to him. And his friend said, "No, you don't think like that. Don't put that vibe out there in the universe, And he said, "No, it's fate. I can't do anything about it. It's fated." He was a great believer that what's going to be will be.
And so, well, let's now, before we get to really what happened with when Mary Todd Lincoln in particular seemingly turned to spiritualism, uh, let's go to the Booth family. Now,
Mhm.
they were a distinguished acting family, theatrical family. As you said, they had started out in England. Were the sons though? Were they born here? Were they not?
Yes, they were born here.
Yeah, they were born here. So Junius Booth is the father, right? Had been married before, and that marriage had not formally ended, even though he represented that it had. Mary's then, is it Mary, uh, who was a who had worked in the stage in London or in the
Mhm.
theatrical environment. She is the mother of what? How many children? Nine, 10 children?
Yes, 10.
10. That's a lot of children. And and they live in Bel Air, Maryland, eventually, right? And so they're not rich, but they live comfortably, certainly by comparison
That's right.
to the Lincoln family, and they have some education. They're a more learned family than
Mhm.
certainly Lincoln's. Um, Now, Junius Booth, who in that family may have been inclined towards superstition and uh, fortune teller. I think John Wilkes Booth, you say, went to a fortune teller and she told him that he had picked up a terrible card and he would have a terrible future. Is
That's
that
right.
right?
That's right. He must have been around 12 when that happened. And what they used to call gypsies, now called Romani more properly, were passing through Maryland, and um, they were camped near the Booth farm. So John Wilkes went down there and had his fortune told. And the fortune teller said, I've never seen, looking at his hand, said, I've never seen a worse hand. I'm sorry. I wish I hadn't seen it. And he was like any 12-year-old would be properly frightened by this. And he said, "Is there anything I could do to escape my bad luck?" And she said, "Well, maybe become a missionary or something. I really don't see what I can do for you." And he tried to laugh it off, but he had a nature where um, he tended to brood about things. He couldn't let go of bad news quite often, and that stayed with him. His sister said that stayed with him for his entire life. That feeling that
Now,
coming.
there's something ominous would happen.
Mhm.
And of course, he's the author. Of course, maybe not. We don't quite know how the cards are dealt, but seemingly he's the author of his own misfortune. Uh, but it's interesting. I mean, they live in Bel Air. It's a border state when the Civil War returns. His older brother, Edwin, who's also an actor and possibly at that time was a most celebrated actor, is a Unionist, right?
That's right. So there was a split, and in a way, there was that's just about right. There was a split in Maryland itself. As a border state, as you say, there were some who were pro-Southern, some pro-Northern, and a big group just wanted it to end and didn't want to have anything, didn't want it to happen.
Right.
So the family split, just like the country did. You're right.
So, and when John Wilkes Booth gets involved with acting, he does a lot of acting, does he not, in Richmond, which will not very will soon become the capital of the Confederacy.
Yes, that's a good point. He did act before the war began in Richmond. He spent 2 years there. He had a very attractive personality. People were drawn to him and they liked him. And he was a troubled person, but not a mean one. You know what I mean? I mean, he could be loving, and you could see years after the war when they felt safe. His friends, although they always rejected what he did, they kind of liked him in his better days. So he bonded with that city. That's the point, right? I mean, he really identified with Richmond, and he was. Although he never acted in the South once the war began, he never went into the Confederate States to act. He stayed in the North, although his sympathies were strongly pro-Southern.
Yeah. So, did any of the boys, because there was sisters Asia and others, but any of the Booth boys participate either with the Union Army or the Confederate Army, or were they all basically engaged in acting and not involved with fighting?
The father had told them that actors should stay out of politics. I mean, it didn't make any sense to alienate half the public before the curtain even went up, right? I mean,
Right.
you're going to have your audience if you're identified with a cause or the other. So the boys stayed out of the army, and I think in John Wilkes Booth's case, that was a big mistake because his sympathies were so pro-Southern. He had to sit on them during the war, and if someone is really conscientious and they're fighting their instincts to do something, it can be bad. They can simmer, they can fester, they can antagonize themselves, and I think that's exactly what happened to him.
So he began to think ill of himself for well, you did a lot of profiles on John Wilkes Booth, and we have Fortune Spool, and he referred to himself as a coward for not enlisting in the Confederate Army, and some thought he was even a part of a spy ring for the Confederacy. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that um, he did think, on the coward point, I think he did think he was a coward. And here, the acting profession plays an interesting role because he's playing heroes on stage. I mean,
Right.
he knows how phony he is, right? He's playing like a hero, and every now and then, a friend up north would call him out. So he would have a political outburst, and they would say, "Well, if you think that, you ought to go down and show some courage." And when anyone said that to him, it hit him like a punch because he knew they were telling the truth. He knew he should be, but because of the pressure from his mother, who had lost four children already, he had respected her wish to stay out of the army. He did, however, at some point when things began to look really bad for the South, he began to intrigue a little bit. He began to think of this idea of abducting Lincoln, and taking him as a prisoner of war into the South. And although that sounds rather fantastical by modern standards, it really was perhaps doable in 1865. I mean, he went out one time with seven armed men. There were eight of them. That was probably enough to grab Lincoln, who often went around, practically unaccompanied.
Yeah.
Some heavily accompanied, sometimes not.
So, but both of them, in some ways, had a providential outlook on life. Both
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. Now we're moving more towards spiritualism with the Lincoln household after the death of Willie. Uh, he was only 11 years old, and that's when Mary Todd Lincoln, who many people now say is bipolar, so forth, I don't know, became inconsolable. And we found it fascinating that she turned to psychics, the Lauries in
Mm-hmm.
Georgetown. That
Mm-hmm.
home still exists, and had seances right in the east in the east room. What was it? The red room? What room? When did she have these
Uh,
seances?
I think the Red Room. Yeah,
Right.
you're
Okay.
you're right about this. Know the death of Willie in 1862, and then before they came to Washington, they lost a little boy named Eddie. So
Yeah.
she had two sons, and Willie. You can't say the death of one child is worse than the other, but he was the most attractive child, the most loving child, the one with the most promise. And then this, I think, is a critical point. She said he was the one when he was older that would take care of her. He was the one that she felt she would be able to count on when she reached her, old age.
Right.
And as we all know, the death of a child is a theft from the future. It really is. There's no other way to say it. A death of a child is a theft from your future. And
Right.
she just wanted to be with him. So she begins to host these seances and even attend them at other places, like the house in Georgetown you mentioned.
And the president joined her, did he not? I mean, some said to just to make her feel better. But I'm not so certain. Did he lock himself in a room every Thursday when, sort of to commemorate the death of Willie? He too found was inconsolable with the
Yeah,
death of Willie.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's an interesting and little known point. Willie died on a Thursday, so he would spend part of that day alone, in grief. And various people tried to counsel with him, ministers and so forth, and they had some success. But I think his mind, according to his law partner William Herndon, his mind was very kind of rational, and anything he couldn't prove, he wasn't inclined to believe. And then don't forget, as a public official, the relentless demands upon your time. There's not enough you to go around for everything that needs to be done. And these necessarily dragged his attention back to the present. And so, he was able maybe to adjust to the loss more than Mary. To some extent, by the understandings of this time, taking care of Willie was her job. And, had she failed at it, you might well ask. So I'm sure she felt loss, she felt guilt, grief, everything you can feel.
Well, she seems to have been a bright woman, whatever her idiosyncrasies, and she didn't have enough to do. I mean, he had plenty to do. He was in the middle of the Civil War. He had to hold the country together. I mean, that had to help him with his grief, like you're suggesting. He had to stay busy. He had to put his mind on his mission. And here was a man who'd always thought he was destined to do something significant. Otherwise, what was the point of life? In the meantime, we have John Wilkes Booth, who is, I don't know if he's turned to any more fortune telling, maybe a little nervous about them, becoming inconsolable about the direction of the war. He's meeting regularly down at Mary Surratt's boarding house with her son, John Surratt, and others, as you pointed out, with originally the intention to kidnap Lincoln and the vice president and etc. And then when at some juncture decides, no, I won't, and all of those efforts were aborted, or not aborted, but I think it was Campbell's house. It was the place they were supposed to, where they had hoped to kidnap him, and Lincoln decided to go take a different, direction that evening, so they couldn't do it. But with Appomattox and what was happening in the war, that's when he decided he was going to kill him. Not that this is about spiritualism, but there's an extraordinary set of, I don't know, coincidences around this whole week. Appomattox occurs on Palm Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Then, Lincoln speaks, obviously, to everyone at the North Portico of the White House, April 11th, 2 days after the fall of Appomattox, rather. And then it's sheer happenstance that John Wilkes Booth goes to the Ford Theater for no purpose other than to collect his mail, right, on the 14th of April, which is Good Friday, when he discovers just by sheer coincidence that the Lincolns will be there that evening. Just think of that. And that's the night that he manages to get this Derringer and kill him. I mean, he doesn't kill him immediately, but it's a fatal wound, and manages as well to get a couple of his cohorts to come after Seward, and the one who was supposed to come after Vice President Johnson ultimately drops the ball. And then think of it, when the nation is assembling to deal with the devastation of this moment. I mean, whatever one's sentiments may have been regarding Abraham Lincoln, if you're the North or South, everybody's depleted by the war. And this now happens, it's Holy Week. People are gathering in synagogues on Saturday, and they're gathering throughout the country for Easter Sunday. I mean, you have to wonder, whether there was something providential about
Hmm.
all of this. With
Hmm.
both of these men, were they the instruments of destiny?
That was certainly the opinion of a lot of ministers, and they felt uh, that this was very unusual timing. There were very few who said Lincoln should not have gone to the theater on a Good Friday, but there were only one or two of those. Um, and that was kind of funny because the site of Ford's Theater used to be the First Baptist Church of Washington. That was originally where the First Baptist Church was in the old days. So a lot of people say, well, something bad will happen there if but it is quite providential, isn't it? That happened. It certainly is, and I think that Booth was impulsive, and one person said very, very reckless as an individual. Again, I like to stress he wasn't like mean spirited, and a lot of people would say he wasn't, but he would jump into things sometimes without thinking ahead, and he he might have attacked Lincoln even sooner if he had had a proper opportunity. But that particular day, that Good Friday, like you said, he went to the theater to collect his mail. The Ford family were from Baltimore, and he was from Baltimore, Booth. So, he was very familiar with the theater. He knew the ins and outs. He was respected and welcomed. He didn't need a pass, of course. He could just walk in, wander around. And as a star, people were glad to see him. Like a lot of the junior actors, up and coming actors, they thought, whoa, there's Mr. Booth, and for most people, it was just, I mean, he was just as popular as you name the movie star, Matt Damon
Yeah,
or
I mean,
any of them.
anybody would let.
Yeah.
He was this was family. I mean, anytime you collect your mail there, you know how much you are a part of the furniture, as it were, of that place. And I don't know that anyone would have thwarted him, even if the one security guard they said had gone out for a drink. But it's so interesting also that that was the morning Abraham Lincoln signed into law the legislation for Secret Service.
What a coincidence. Like you
I
said,
mean, it's just amazing.
it's very
It
providential.
is, it does seem, and you think Lincoln enjoys almost semi-deity status in the collective consciousness of the country. And you have to think with all those messages that were poured out in the wake of his death, you know, on Easter Sunday, it had to elevate
Hmm.
thinking about him to a semi-deity status.
I might add,
Um, Go ahead,
and
please.
you tell me what you think about this. Several of his acquaintances said he could not have died at a point more greater for his fame. In other words, he didn't have to live through Reconstruction. He didn't have to figure out what to do
Right.
after the war, right? He died, as far as his reputation, he could not have died at a better time than he did at the very apex of his successes.
No, I mean, no, I think that is true. It's terrible to say, but there is truth to it, I think, that he set it in motion. He pulled off marshaling the votes, as we know from Spielberg's Lincoln for the 13th Amendment. And I don't know that the Reconstruction could have even taken life with Ulysses S. Grant because it didn't happen until he happened, were it not for the enormous loss the country experienced, uh, with Abraham Lincoln. But Lincoln himself kept having dreams that all of this was going to happen. I mean, he kept envisioning this casket, was it not, in the White House, going in there asking people who had died, and they would tell him it was the president. I don't know if did Booth have other types of premonitions that are comparable to what Lincoln had?
One thing that a project I'm working on right now, and this probably fits in psychologically. One thing you've been kind enough to refer to my book several times, and I'll describe things, but I won't put a modern diagnostic label on it because number one, I don't know enough to do it, and number two, it may not be fair to these people to say you're this or you're that, right? I just kind of put the symptoms out there, and then everybody can draw their judgments. But one thing that I noticed about him that spring is he just could not sleep. He could not go to sleep. He must have been running on the day of the assassination on fumes, I guess. I don't know how he kept on his feet, but he was just having a great deal of time. And when he did dream, it was always about this. It was always about dealing with Lincoln, kidnapping Lincoln, being a hero and shooting Lincoln. He was obsessed with this. I'm not surprised Lincoln didn't have those dreams though, because he had a fatalistic attitude, as I said, and he told a number of people, well, I know that people threaten me. Well, what can I do about it? I can't live in a cage. To be president, I've got to go out. I've got to be among the people. And I think I'm not surprised at the same time he'd be less than human if it didn't occur to him, that there were a few evilly minded people out there who might want to do something to him.
There's not much you can do,
Mm-hmm.
really. All you can do is hope. With the Secret Service, you hope they can find the killer. And of course, with Stanton, they had this massive manhunt. Um, it's a fascinating time in the history of the country. And these two men, I'm glad that you have provided more texture to who we understand regarding John Wilkes Booth. Um, he was no, as you pointed out, he wouldn't have been such a success on the stage, I guess, if he hadn't been somewhat likable. He was charming, a very handsome guy. And you would think he wouldn't have reason to engage in a behavior of this sort in order to have significance, but he wanted greater significance than what he had. And all he did was ultimately catapult Lincoln, the man that he thought wanted to be a king. He's the one that catapulted him into a semi-deity status.
That's a very good point. I mean, to some extent, Lincoln was given an assist by John Wilkes Booth and the terrible act that he accompanied. It is true. Booth was a really fine actor, but he at some point, that was awfully a lot of wearing and tearing. I mean, those plays could be a couple of hours long. They ended with an exhausting sword fight, most of them, and it would say sometimes when the curtain would go down after a sword fight and the curtain fell, he might lay on the stage for 5 or even 10 minutes before he got up. He was just physically exhausted. And then next week, you have to go to Chicago and do it all over again. I mean, so he, at some point, late as the war went on, he didn't find any satisfaction, although he was making good money. He didn't find any satisfaction in it and began to fret again about the course of the war. And then now we see why it was unfortunate that he didn't go into the Confederate Army and get himself shot about halfway through. Which,
Well, he would never have been able, at least he now lives in infamy, unfortunately, on the first assassination of an American president.
well,
Those were tough times. I mean, tough times in America.
I'm sorry to interject. I don't mean to interrupt you at all, but
Not at all.
again, you made me think of a good point. And this was indeed the first one, the first assassination. It had never happened before. Many people couldn't even conceive it. Today, I think if a president was shot, we would be horrified, but not necessarily surprised because we know things like that can happen. I think in this time they were both horrified and surprised. They didn't believe anything like that was ever going to happen. Lincoln
Well, I
being
mean, to think that you lived through a war, I mean, an awful war. That was a tough war because that's, I mean, hand to hand. And it was neighbor to neighbor, cousin, brother. I mean, it was rough and a lot of death. And so to think that you finally are bringing it to closure, whether you like the outcome or not, and then for this to happen was just a bit. I remember when they shot Kennedy. I mean, we were transfixed. Part of it was television. He was so young and just so he represented a new generation. He was full of promise. So young and handsome couple, and then for this to happen, it's always unsettling for us to be reminded of our mortality.
Mhm.
And as you pointed out with Mary Todd Lincoln, you lose a child, you lose something of your future, and that certainly the case was with Kennedy as such a young president, but with Lincoln, the notion that finally we reached a point of some closure, and there it was all upended with
Mhm.
this brutal assassination. So I guess I'd ask you as sort of a footnote to all of it. Is
Mhm.
there some special takeaway that that exists regarding this moment, regarding this experience? People who are so grieving so much that they turn to spiritualists, not that there's anything wrong with that, um, that a lesson or an understanding that you would uh, want to share with us.
I, in all my looking at this topic and the other things I've written, I've always tried to just understand these people as people, and I see, their clothes change and their hairstyles change, and that we travel faster, we eat better, we live in more comfort generally, but they are people, right? And there's a lot to be learned. It's not the dates, and it's not what happened, what year did this happen. I mean, even I have to look those things up every now and then. But the human understandings you gain, the problems they face, that they can't, no president, no mayor can go in, snap her fingers, and I mean, it's you have to deal with people. You have to understand, like Lincoln did, work with divergent parties. Lincoln was great, I think, because he was a little bit more progressive than the country was. So he kept, you know, he went forward, but he didn't go so far forward that he lost, the public. They always went with him, and they never regretted it.
No, and as you pointed out, I don't know if he would be held in such high regard if he hadn't paid the ultimate sacrifice. But it's miraculous the country was still standing, given all that transpired, and and it's edifying to understand how they all had this connection many times over with the Booths and the Lincolns, but to include spiritualism. Dr. Alford, you've been wonderful. We really appreciate your insights, and you certainly have enriched our series on the defining fathers. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this wonderful program. I appreciate it.
Okay, look forward to seeing you again.